Returning home from evening service, the old woman expected to see the usual mess. Instead, she was met with sterile cleanliness and the acrid smell of bleach. In the middle of her living room, on his knees, wept her strange, polite mailman, and above him, with a crowbar in hand, stood a real burglar. In that moment, she didn't scream. She didn't call the police. Silently, without a single emotion on her face, she turned, walked to her kitchen, and picked up an old cast-iron skillet, blackened by time. The precise digital chirp of the alarm clock sliced through the silence at exactly 6 in the morning. Arthur Miller didn't slam the button, but pressed it gently, silencing the harsh sound. His first act, before his feet even touched the cold laminate floor, was a calculated ritual. He rose, walked to the window overlooking the empty street bathed in the gray pre-dawn light, and ran the tip of his index finger along the white sill. The finger came away clean. Good. Order was maintained. Moved to the bathroom, where every surface gleamed with polished chrome and white tile. A 7-minute shower, the water at a strictly controlled, barely warm temperature. A 2-minute toothbrushing session with circular motions, 30 seconds for each quadrant of his jaw, as his dentist had prescribed years ago. A shave against the grain, until a faint irritation gave way to a perfect, unnatural smoothness. Finally, he approached his closet, where his armor hung alone and immaculate. The mail carrier's uniform, pressed to a crisp. In his sterile kitchen, Arthur denied himself the luxury and mess associated with cooking. Breakfast was a pre-measured portion of plain oatmeal, prepared with water and no sugar or salt, stored in a sealed glass container. He ate it standing, his jaw moving mechanically as he stared at the empty stainless steel sink. Food was fuel, nothing more. Then came the key, almost sacred, moment of his morning routine. Polishing his work boots. He spread a fresh sheet of newspaper on the floor, took out his brushes. Each boot was treated with surgical precision until the black, dense leather began to reflect the cold, fluorescent light like a dark, distorted mirror. In that sheen, he saw a blurred reflection of his own face, stern, focused, devoid of emotion. This was more than just preparing for work. It was an act of meditation, a confirmation of his control over the world. Only when everything was flawless could he step outside his door. The inner critic, whose voice was achingly similar to that of his late mother, Beatrice, his postal route was a symphony of predictability. 8 miles of orderly suburbia, where every lawn was mown and every mailbox stood in its proper place. The click of a lid opening, the rustle of letters sliding in, a polite, barely perceptible nod to a passerby. A step, a turn, the next porch. It was a rhythm that soothed him, but today, about halfway through, this mechanical harmony faltered. Approaching the house at 112 Maple Street, Arthur felt a familiar. The lawn was overgrown with tall, insolent dandelions. A cobweb hung lazily from the corner of the porch, and most egregiously, the mailbox was ajar. A promotional flyer from the previous day, soaked with morning dew, stuck out like a mocking tongue. In Arthur's world, where every object had its place and function, this was not mere sloppiness. It was an act of aggression. It was the physical manifestation of chaos invading his ordered territory. A personal affront. With a grimace of disgust no one could see, Arthur tried to gently push the fresh mail past the jammed paper trash. The metal lid wouldn't close. He tried again, and at that exact moment, the front door of 112 Maple Street creaked open. A short, stout, elderly woman in an old, faded housecoat appeared on the threshold. Helen Peterson. She said nothing. Her face, a road map of wrinkles, expressed nothing but weariness. She simply extended a gnarled, strong hand and silently took the She didn't even grant him a glance, turning and disappearing back into the dark doorway. Her complete, absolute indifference to his presence, to his immaculate uniform, to his polite nod frozen in mid-air, was worse than any insult. It was a total negation of his existence, his function, his world. In the deafening silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves, Beatrice's cold, clear voice sounded in his head for the first time that day. Filth. Ungrateful. From that day on, the house at 112 Maple Street became an unhealing wound for Arthur, a festering, inflamed focal point of his root. The thought of it became an obsession. He started noticing everything. The crookedly hung curtain in the living room window, which looked like a bruised, swollen eye. A bag of garbage left on the porch overnight, emitting a faint but distinct sour smell the next day. The thick, cloying aroma of garlic and onions that wafted from a cracked kitchen window, which to him smelled of decay. Each of these elements was not just a detail, it was a personal insult, a small but audacious victory of chaos over his ordered world. His professional mask, worn for years, began to crack. He caught himself lingering at Helen Peterson's house for an extra 10 or 15 seconds, an unacceptable breach of his internal regulations, trying to peer into the windows as if searching for new evidence of her criminal negligence. His carefully constructed peace was being systematically dismantled. The passive revulsion that had been building inside him quickly escalated into an active, almost scientific interest. Arthur could no longer just react. He had to understand his enemy, study her habits, and find her vulnerability. After work, instead of driving directly to his sterile fortress on the other side of town, he started taking a detour. He would drive slowly down Maple Street, park at the end of the block in the shadow of a large oak tree, and watch. 5:30 p.m. Helen Peterson comes out to water withered geraniums. 7 p.m. The kitchen light comes on. He noticed a pattern. On Tuesdays and Saturdays, around 7 in the evening, she would get into her old rattling sedan and drive off somewhere for several hours. His obsession was transforming into a methodical, cold investigation, one he justified to himself as gathering data for subsequent problem elimination. This was no longer about a messy yard. It was about restoring. The rain was falling. Not a heavy downpour, but a fine, cold, persistent drizzle that saturated the air with grayness and gloom. As Arthur, hunched under the brim of his cap, approached 112 Maple Street, he saw a scene that became for him the apotheosis of chaos. Raindrops, mixing with the thick layer of dust on the living room window, formed grimy, winding streaks, like scars or tears on an unwashed face. This image, of a house weeping with filth, an icy wave of pure, animalistic panic rose from his stomach, constricting his lungs. The air suddenly felt thick and viscous. His fingers, suddenly alien, wooden and disobedient, went slack. The heavy mailbag, filled with the sacred order of white envelopes, fell with a dull, wet thud onto the soaked lawn. The pristine white envelopes scattered across the emerald grass, instantly spotting with brown patches of mud. The sacred cargo he carried had been defiled. Arthur collapsed to his knees, his body. He tried to gather the letters, but his fingers wouldn't obey, sliding over the wet paper and smearing the mud even more. He saw black earth clinging to his perfectly pressed navy blue trousers. In that moment, the external world, the rain, the street, the houses, vanished. He was left alone with a deafening, piercing scream in his head. Beatrice's voice, full of icy, contemptuous rage, repeated over and over like a skipping record. Clumsy, filthy, you ruined everything. Look at your... Returning to his fortress, Arthur immediately began the ritual of purification. But this time it wasn't a calm rite, but a furious act of exorcism. He tore off his defiled uniform without even trying to save it, crumpled it into a ball, and shoved it into a double-lined trash bag. Then he stood in the shower and violently scrubbed his skin with a stiff brush until it was red and raw, trying to wash away not just the physical dirt, but a metaphysical stain. This breakdown, he understood. Helen Peterson's chaos was an infection, an aggressive virus that had begun to spread and contaminate his own carefully guarded world. Passive observation and silent judgment were no longer effective. An infection isn't meant to be contained. An infection must be excised. He had to enter the source of the contamination, the house at 112 Maple Street, and conduct a full, total sanitization. This was no longer a whim. It was an Tuesday arrived. Evening settled over the suburb, wrapping the neat houses in a blue dusk. Arthur sat in his car, parked in the shadow of overgrown maples at the end of the street. He was motionless, a part of the scenery. He was watching. He knew today was one of the days marked in his notebook, and right on cue, at 7:15, the front door of 112 Maple Street opened. Helen Peterson, dressed in her Sunday best dark dress, she carefully locked the door, got into her old sputtering sedan, and after a cough from the engine, slowly pulled away. Arthur, his headlights off, waited a few seconds, and then followed. Helen's car turned into an older part of town and stopped in front of a small, nondescript building, St. Jude's Community Hall. He looked at his watch. He had at least an hour, maybe an hour and a half. The window of opportunity was open. He felt a surge of cold purpose. Arthur returned to Maple Street but drove past Helen's house. He parked his car around the corner on an adjacent street to avoid drawing attention. He opened the trunk. There, on a clean rubber mat, lay his sanitation kit. A simple canvas bag in which rubber gloves, several new sponges, a roll of black trash bags, and bottles of industrial-strength cleaners were neatly packed to prevent rattling. His heart pounded in his chest, but this time it was steady and strong, like a metronome. It was the cold, focused anticipation of a surgeon before a complex but necessary operation. Hiding in the deep shadows of a privet hedge, he slipped into the backyard of 112 Maple Street, toward the door whose lock he had already studied from a distance. The air was cool and damp, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. He was an agent of order, preparing to cleanse a pocket of chaos from the world. He felt no guilt, only a profound... Arthur's hand, clad in a thin latex glove, was already reaching for the small set of lockpicks in his pocket. But something, some ingrained professional habit, made him pause. One last check. He crouched down, his knees almost touching the damp grass, and peered into the dark living room window. His heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer with a frantic, panicked rhythm. Inside, in the near total darkness, it wasn't a play of light from a street lamp, not a tree branch. It was definitively a human silhouette. A slow, lazy, heavy movement, as if someone sitting in an armchair was slowly rising to their feet. The thoughts in Arthur's head dissolved into white noise. Had Helen returned? But how? The door was locked. Her car was at the community hall. Or she wasn't there alone? His meticulously planned sanitation operation had just turned into a confrontation with an unknown. And the shadow moved, and Arthur Miller's world, so orderly and predictable, collapsed into a point of primal, animal terror. Instinct, suppressed for decades by rituals and discipline, took over. He didn't think, he acted. Stumbling back from the window, he fell into the thick lilac bushes, wet with night dew. Cold, supple branches whipped across his face, scratching his cheek, but he felt no pain. All he could feel was the deafening thunder of his own heart, pounding in his ears. All his carefully laid plans, all his righteous, cold fury, his entire mission of sanitation, It all evaporated in an instant. All that remained was a sticky, paralyzing fear. Forgetting the canvas bag with his tools left by the wall of the house, he stumbled and slipped in the mud, scrambling out of the yard. He ran to his inconspicuous car and, turning the key with a trembling, disobedient hand, peeled away, leaving behind a battlefield where he had suffered a crushing. Arthur's fortress was no longer safe. Returning to his sterile bungalow, he found no solace in its impeccable cleanliness. He was contaminated by fear, by failure, by the real dirt from the bushes now smeared on his trousers. He paced from corner to corner, from the perfectly aligned furniture to the empty white walls, like a caged animal. But this time, the cage was not outside. It was within. His mother Beatrice's voice was merciless. It didn't just echo in his head, it seemed to emanate from every coward. You always were one. Ran with your tail between your legs from your own shadow. I raised a weak, worthless, useless son. He went into the bathroom and turned on the water, full blast, trying to drown out that icy, cutting voice. But it only grew louder, mingling with the roar. He saw the shadow again and again, and with each vision it became more real, more menacing. He didn't sleep at all that night. He was trapped not in a house. The next day on his postal route was torture. Every step required immense effort. Approaching 112 Maple Street, Arthur felt his palms sweat inside his gloves. He forced himself to look up at that same living room window. And he saw it. Just outside the glass, a few feet from the house, stood an old, gnarled tree. One of its thick branches, bent like the hand of an arthritic old man, swayed slowly in the wind. In the daylight, it was just a tree, but at night, in the dark, its movement could indeed cast a shadow on the wall. A wave of dizzying, almost nauseating relief washed over Arthur, followed immediately by a surge of burning, humiliating shame. He, Arthur James Miller, a man of control and order, had been frightened by a tree. Beatrice's voice in his head was full of venomous, triumphant sarcasm. Of course. What else could I have expected? Scared of your own shadow. You are pathetic. This humiliation was the final catalyst. He could no longer retreat. Tonight. Tonight he would prove, not to her, but to... That night, Arthur returned. This time, he was driven not by righteous anger, but by a cold, vengeful, desperate fury. A fury at Helen Peterson, at that damned tree, but most of all, at himself, at his own weakness. He approached the back door where his first enemy awaited, an old, rust-spotted lock. He took out his set of lockpicks, his fingers moving quickly and precisely. He inserted the first pick, but the metal, corroded by decades of moisture, wouldn't yield. A loud, unpleasant screech, like a gunshot in the night silence, echoed out. He froze, listening. Silence. Only the chirping of crickets. He pressed on the pick again, his palms sweating, the tool threatening to slip. Finally, with a loud, dry, sickening click that seemed to resonate in his teeth, the lock gave way. This small victory felt monumental, a reclaiming of his resolve against the forces that had nearly broken him. The first victory proved premature. When Arthur gently pulled the door toward him, it emitted a long, agonizing, heart-wrenching squeal, like the groan of a dying animal. The sound was a physical pain, piercing his eardrums and making every muscle in his body tense. He froze on the spot, certain that lights would now flash on all over the street, dogs would start barking, and someone would peer out a window and call the police. But the world remained silent. Holding his breath, He began to push the door. He searched for that one perfect, saving angle where the old rusty hinges would fall silent. It was torture. A slow, tense, meticulous struggle with a rebellious mechanism that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Every inch was a battle, and every new creak made him freeze. Finally, the gap was wide enough. He slipped inside into the darkness and silence. He gently pulled the door almost closed behind him and switched on his small, powerful flashlight. His heart, a bright, narrow beam, snatched a scene from the darkness that confirmed all his worst fears, and simultaneously brought a strange, perverse satisfaction. A stack of yellowed newspapers against the wall, dotted with the tiny, dark traces of mouse droppings. A cobweb in the corner, thick and dense as cotton, tangled with the husks of dead insects. And the smell. Oh, that smell. A thick, suffocating mixture of dust, the sour tang of old, forgotten food, dampness, and something else. It was the sense of abandonment, of slow decay. Arthur felt nausea rise in his throat. This wasn't just a home. It was a lair of chaos. He took a step forward, and his boot landed on something soft and sticky on the floor, with a sickening, wet crunch. It was exactly as he had imagined, a physical manifestation of the disorder he was born to combat. He was not just an intruder, he was a purifier. Before tackling his main objective, the living room, Arthur, true to his methodical nature, decided to conduct a quick reconnaissance to assess the scale of the infestation. A hallway, another door. He pushed it open, expecting to see a continuation of the nightmare, scattered clothes, filth, disarray. But what he saw made him freeze in utter bewilderment. It was a pantry. And inside it, in this epicenter of chaos, reigned a perfect. Jars of homemade pickles and preserves stood on the shelves in flawless rows, sorted by size, labels facing out. Boxes of pasta, rice, and grains were stacked in perfect cubes. Neatly folded shopping bags hung from a nail. This tiny island of immaculate order was an unsolvable, maddening puzzle for Arthur. It made no sense whatsoever. The jarring contrast between this sanctuary of tidiness and the surrounding squalor was a logical impossibility. Arthur stood mesmerized, unable to look away. His brain, which operated on strict binary algorithms of order versus disorder, desperately tried to find a logical explanation. Was this some form of schizophrenia? Perhaps Helen Peterson was afflicted like him, but her obsession with cleanliness extended only to her food supplies? Or was it something more? He ran a gloved finger over one of the jars, checking for dust. Perfectly clean. He even knocked on the back wall behind the shelves, searching for a hidden door, a secret panel. This anomaly, this island of logic in a world of irrational chaos, shattered his entire worldview. Unable to find a rational kernel, he made the only decision possible for his overloaded brain: to ignore it. He slammed the door shut, literally cutting himself off from the confusing, illogical puzzle. He had a mission, and this bizarre contradiction was a distraction he could not afford. The living room awaited its purification. Now nothing distracted him from his primary mission. The living room. He entered it like an exorcist entering the room of a possessed person, ready to cast out the demon of disorder. He unfurled a large black trash bag, and the rustling sound of the plastic was like a declaration of war. First to go were the old yellowed newspapers, then the withered, slimy flowers from a vase, along with the stagnant, murky, foul-smelling water. Empty cups with dry. He worked quickly, methodically, ruthlessly. He wiped the dust from every surface, aligned the books on the shelf by height, and arranged the trinkets on the mantelpiece in perfect symmetry. He wasn't just cleaning. He was performing a sacred ritual of banishment, destroying the traces of another's incorrect, chaotic life. With each swipe of his cloth, he felt a measure of control returning, a sense of imposing his righteous will. When the surfaces were done, Arthur looked at the floor. An old, threadbare rug concealed the heart of the problem. He was absolutely certain of it. With a grunt of effort, he rolled it up and dragged it to a corner. What he saw underneath sent a jolt of dark, predatory triumph through him. Besides old, ingrained dark stains, several of the floorboards were unevenly nailed down, and one of them even sagged slightly under his foot, letting out a quiet groan. This was it. Under these boards, he was sure, lay the cause of everything. A leaking, rotting pipe, a nest of rodents, a cache of something disgusting and filthy. He had found the tumor that now had to be excised. This physical flaw in the foundation of the house was the secret he had been searching for, the ultimate proof that the chaos was not just superficial, but structural. He felt a surge of validation, dropped to his knees. He tried to pry up the protruding board with his fingers, but only managed to tear a nail, feeling a sharp, stabbing pain. The pain mingled with his fury, amplifying it. He rushed to the kitchen and began frantically rummaging through the drawers, ignoring their greasy, sticky contents until he found what he needed, an old, sturdy dinner knife with a thick, unbending blade. Returning, he plunged it into the crack between the was his new physical conflict, a battle against stubborn, unyielding matter. He used the knife as a lever, putting all his meager weight into it. The wood groaned, old nails resisted, and splinters flew. He grunted, sweat pouring into his eyes. Finally, with a deafening, tearing crack, the first board gave way. The sound of victory was raw and violent, a testament to his sheer, desperate force. Having ripped off the first board, he set upon the rest with a doubled, almost animalistic fury. A few minutes later, an ugly, dark hole gaped in the floor before him. Trembling with anticipation, Arthur shone his flashlight into it, ready to see something horrid, something that would confirm his righteousness. The reveal was stunning in its absolute, mocking banality. Beneath the boards, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. No secret cache, just packed, dry earth, dusty utility pipes, and a faint smell of dampness. It was simply a poorly, crookedly made floor in an old, dilapidated house. His entire theory, his investigation, his great discovery. It was all a sham. And in that moment, it hit him. Not disappointment, but a blind, irrational, all-consuming rage at a world that was not just dirty, but also utterly, mockingly meaningless. The chaos had no— Arthur Miller stared into the black, empty, ugly hole in the floor, and the momentary, sharp disappointment instantly morphed into a searing, purifying rage. He had been deceived. Chaos was not just filthy, it was duplicitous and meaningless. This rage became a fuel for him, purer and more potent than anxiety. It did not paralyze, it focused. He was no longer an investigator searching for hidden meanings in the disorder. He was an executioner. With a strength born of pure anger, he grabbed the torn-up boards and, with a deafening bang, shoved them back into the opening, not caring about alignment or nails. He was simply hiding the ugly, meaningless void from sight. The voice of his mother, Beatrice, usually so loud and insistent, fell silent for a moment, as if surprised by this new, active, masculine fury that had displaced the familiar trembling anxiety. Driven by this dark, cold energy, Arthur transformed into a whirlwind of efficiency. He found an old but powerful vacuum cleaner in a hallway closet, and its deafening, piercing roar filled the house, banishing not only the dust, but also the oppressive silence. He ran it over every inch of the room, every corner, every crevice, listening with grim satisfaction as dirt, dust, and small debris rattled and clattered up the plastic tube. He had found a new enemy. Next, he grabbed the furniture polish he had brought with him. He generously sprayed the dull, scratched wooden furniture and rubbed it in with fast, circular motions until the surfaces began to reflect the light like dark, still water. He washed the windows from the inside, fiercely scrubbing away the grimy streaks of rain that had sent him into a panic just the day before. The room was transforming before his eyes. From an old, neglected living den, it was becoming what it ought to be. A lifeless. Finished, Arthur switched off the vacuum. The silence that returned was entirely different now. It wasn't oppressive. It held no threat. It rang with cleanliness. The air smelled not of dust, age, and another person's life, but of the sharp, chemical, sterile scent of lemon and bleach. His scent. The beam of his flashlight glided slowly over the gleaming surfaces, finding not a single speck of dust, not a single flaw. In that moment, a wave of pure, unadulterated, he had done it. He hadn't just cleaned, he had conquered. He had subjugated another's reality, erased it, and rewritten it according to his own correct laws. A sense of omnipotence, which he hadn't felt since he was a little boy who had perfectly made his bed, filled him. He was in control. He was the master of this small world he had ordered. It was a perfect, silent monument to basking in his triumph. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the chemical fragrance of his victory. And in that perfect silence, he heard it. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. An insistent, methodical, relentless sound he hadn't noticed before. It was an old pendulum wall clock that he had meticulously wiped down but forgotten to stop. The sound, once just part of the general disorder, now sounded like the countdown on an explosive device. He stared at the clock face. 8:47. Nearly an hour and a half had passed. Helen Peterson could be back any minute. The intoxicating, sweet euphoria vanished instantly, replaced by an icy, cloying, suffocating panic. His perfect, timeless sanctuary suddenly had a deadline, and it was rapidly approaching. His victory was fragile, and the real world was about. Panic is also a form of energy, but a chaotic, destructive one. Arthur's movements became sharp and jerky, like a broken marionette's. He began to dart around the room, frantically covering his tracks. He wiped the doorknobs he had touched, the light switch, the spots on the floor where he had knelt. He gathered his empty cleaner bottles and his rags, crumpled them up, and stuffed them into his canvas bag. His mind was torn between two Get out now, immediately, and leave no trace. Everything must be perfect. The perfectionism drilled into him since infancy was locked in a mortal struggle with the primal instinct for self-preservation, and this battle was driving him to the brink of a complete and final breakdown. Every second wasted on cleaning was a second closer to being discovered, yet leaving an imperfect. The bag was packed. The retreat through the back door was clear. Arthur was ready to bolt, to dissolve into the saving darkness of the night, when his flashlight, making one final sweeping check of the room, caught it. On the perfectly clean, polished to a gleam hardwood floor, almost in the very center of the room, was a single, old, ingrained stain, the size of a nickel. In this sterile, flawless room, this temple of order he had just erected, it looked like a mockery, like a brazen, smirking face, like the last surviving soldier of the army of chaos, staring at Arthur and laughing silently in his face. All his work, His entire victory, his triumph, it was all called into question by this small, stubborn, undefeated spot. It was a final, defiant blemish on his masterpiece, a symbol that his control was, and always. Arthur couldn't leave. To leave the stain would be to admit defeat, to concede that chaos was ultimately invincible. That would be worse than being caught. He dropped his bag and fell to his knees. This was his new, final, most desperate physical conflict. He tried to rub the stain with his gloved finger, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled the last clean sponge from his bag, poured the remnants of his strongest, most caustic cleaner onto it, and began to scrub. He scrubbed with a vengeance, pouring into that simple, monotonous motion all his hatred for disorder, all his pain, all his despair, his entire life. His shoulders heaved, and he breathed heavily through clenched teeth, making quiet, guttural sounds. The battle was no longer with the house, but with this single, defiant imperfection that represented everything he loathed in the world. He was a man possessed, a soldier. Ingrained in the pores of the old wood for decades, the stain did not surrender. It only faded slightly, turning from black to a dark brown. In a fit of complete, irrational madness, Arthur tore the rubber glove from his hand and deployed his last, most primitive weapon: his own fingernails. He began to scrape at the unyielding, dirt-infused wood. His nails broke, and the thin skin on his fingertips tore, but he didn't stop. He felt no pain, only an all-consuming, sacred need to destroy. Droplets of his own blood mixed with the harsh chemical, forming a strange, pink, hissing foam. He was no longer fighting the stain. He was fighting his mother's legacy, his own fear, his worthlessness. Each scrape was an act of defiance against the internal voice that had tormented him for years. This was his penance and his rebellion, a bloody sacrament performed. And then, finally, a miracle happened. Whether from the hellish mixture of chemicals, the furious friction, or his own blood, the stain began to disappear. It didn't vanish completely, but it faded to a pale, barely perceptible shadow of its former self, visible only to someone who knew where to look. To Arthur, in his altered state, this was a total and unconditional victory. Exhausted and depleted, he fell back, sitting directly on the floor. He looked at his bloody, trembling fingers, then at his nearly vanquished foe. An absolute, ringing silence filled the room, broken only by the relentless ticking of the clock. He felt a strange, painful, hard-won tranquility. He had done it. He had won. In that moment of pure, agonizing triumph, he was finally at peace, the silence in the room mirroring a newfound silence in his own head. In this hard-won, sterile silence, a new, alien sound arose. Not the long groan of old hinges he had dreaded, but the short, sharp, prosaic squeak of the back door, which he hadn't fully latched in his frantic haste. Arthur froze, and his fragile peace shattered. His first thought was as cold and clear as a shard of ice. Helen Peterson. She's back. He slowly, very slowly, raised his head, not even trying to hide. He was ready. He wanted to see her face. He wanted to see her shock and horror at how her filthy, chaotic lair had been transformed into a gleaming temple of purity. He awaited the appearance of a small, stooped, frightened old woman. He braced himself for her confusion, her fear, perhaps even her gratitude. The door opened, but it was not Helen Peterson on the threshold. A tall, wiry man entered the room, ducking his head slightly to avoid hitting the doorframe. He wore a dark, baggy hoodie with the hood pulled low over his eyes. In his hand, he swung a heavy metal crowbar, lazily, almost casually. He didn't sneak in. He just entered, as if it were his own house, as if he had every right to be there. He froze for a moment, staring in surprise at the bizarre, ludicrous scene. The intruder's gaze took in the perfectly clean room, the sharp smell of chemicals, and the man in a mail carrier's uniform sitting on the floor with bloody fingers. The surprise on his shadowed face quickly soured into a sullen, lazy annoyance. He was not expecting this. This was an anomaly. In that instant, the complex, multi-layered world of Arthur Miller, built on rituals, memories, and fears, ceased to exist. His entire internal war against metaphorical chaos, his titanic struggle for cleanliness, his endless, exhausting dialogue with his mother's ghost, all of it turned to dust, to nothing. Before him was not a symbol, not an incorrectness, not a memory. Before him was a crude, physical, real threat. The man with the crowbar took a step forward. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice raspy and bored. There was no curiosity or fear in it, only weariness and a veiled menace. The psychological drama was over. A brutal, banal crime thriller had begun, and Arthur, the supposed victor, was now its unarmed, pathetic, random victim. His meticulously ordered world had been invaded by a variable he could never have anticipated. Arthur Miller looked at the man with the crowbar, and his brain, that complex, fine-tuned mechanism designed for classification, systematization, and the maintenance of order, failed. In his world, in his carefully constructed universe, only two fundamental categories existed: order, predictable, clean, correct, and disorder, chaotic, dirty, incorrect. This man fit into neither. He was a third, unthinkable category, not provided. Crowbar in his hand wasn't merely out of place. It was a weapon. A cold, heavy, crude piece of metal whose sole purpose was destruction. For the first time in his 42 years, Arthur faced a problem that couldn't be solved with a cloth, a brush, and a cleaning agent. His mind, accustomed to neatly categorizing the world, was paralyzed in the face of a coarse, amorphous physical reality that I'm the mailman. The words escaped Arthur on their own, thin, pathetic, almost inaudible in the tense, thick silence. It was his last, desperate, instinctive attempt to take shelter behind his social role, his uniform, the function that defined his existence. The burglar let out a short, dismissive, guttural chuckle. "I don't give a damn if you're the Pope. Get up, slowly." Arthur tried to obey, tried to make his muscles work. He instinctively scrambled backward, sliding on the smooth floor until his shoulder blades hit the cold, hard, perfectly clean wall. He was trapped. Cornered in the very temple of order he had just created. He looked down at his bloody, trembling fingers, at the nearly vanished stain on the floor, and his hours-long, titanic struggle seemed absurd, pathetic, a child's game. The burglar's eyes scanned the room lazily. They didn't see cleanliness or order. They didn't appreciate the symmetry of the arranged objects. They simply scanned for valuables, a television, trinkets on the mantel, anything that could be quickly grabbed and sold. "You're a weird one, mailman," he said, more a statement of fact than a question. "Enough screwing around. Where does the old lady hide her cash? Talk, or I'll smash your head in with this thing." And the threat was simple, devoid of ambiguity, just like the crowbar itself. Arthur had no answer. He knew nothing. His silence and his frightened, lost expression irritated the burglar. He had come for a quick, easy score, not to deal with a strange, bloodied mailman. "Fine. Don't want to talk. We'll do it the hard way." He gripped the crowbar firmly with both hands, preparing to swing. The crowbar rose slowly, almost lazily, into the air. For Arthur, time stretched out like thick, viscous molasses. He saw the dim light from his fallen flashlight glint off the rough metal head. He saw the dust motes still dancing in the air, tiny, bitter proof that even his perfect, hard-won cleanliness was flawed. He heard the insistent, methodical ticking of the wall clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock, counting down the last remaining seconds of braced for the crushing, skull-splitting pain and the darkness that would follow. And in that very moment, in that final second, a miracle occurred. The voice of his mother, Beatrice, his eternal tormentor, his internal judge and executioner, fell silent for the first time in 42 years. It didn't disappear or fade. It simply stopped. An absolute, blissful, ringing. It was in this second of deafening internal silence that a new, real, external sound was heard. Not the squeak of the back door, but the crisp, confident, prosaic click of the lock on the front door. Helen Peterson was home from her meeting early. She walked into her house, closed the door behind her, and froze in the hallway. Her eyes, accustomed to the dim light, instantly took in the scene that defied all logic. Her living room, usually comfortably cluttered, now shone with an On the floor, pressed against the wall, sat her frightened, strange mailman with his bloody hands. And towering over him, crowbar raised, was an unknown man in a dark hoodie. The burglar, caught off guard, turned in confusion at the sound, giving Arthur another short, gasping breath. But the most astonishing, the most incredible thing, was Helen's reaction. Her face showed no fear, no panic, no surprise. Only a shadow of a deep, as if she had come home to find a burst pipe or that the neighbor's cat had soiled the rug. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She didn't run. Without a single word, she took 2 quick, almost silent steps back into the darkness of the hallway leading to the kitchen, and vanished. Her retreat was so quiet, so businesslike and purposeful, that it seemed more threatening. The burglar, assuming the old woman was scared and hiding, smirked. "Well, look who's home. Now we can have a little chat," he muttered, apparently deciding to deal with what he perceived to be the easier target first. He took a step toward the dark hallway. "Hey, Grandma, come on out. Don't be afraid." He didn't get to finish. From the darkness of the kitchen doorway, it appeared, a natural, deadly extension of her hand. A heavy, black, venerable cast-iron skillet. In the faint, trembling light of the flashlight on the floor, its blackened surface, tempered by decades of cooking and cleaning, seemed to be made of the same material as the burglar's crowbar. This was not kitchenware. It was a weapon. Taken from Helen Peterson did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She put into that single blow all her hidden, rustic strength, all the rage accumulated over a long, hard life for her violated peace. The skillet described a short, swift, whistling arc. There was a terrible, dull, wet, crunching sound that Arthur felt in his own bones, the sound of heavy metal crushing a skull. The burglar let out a short, surprised, gurgling gasp, his eyes widening under the hood before rolling back. The crowbar fell with a deafening metallic clang onto the perfectly clean floor, leaving a deep gash in the wood. Following it, the burglar's body collapsed to the floor like a sack of potatoes. A dark pool began to spread out from under his head, a stark, vivid stain. Arthur stared at the motionless body, at Helen, who was breathing heavily, still clutching the skillet, and his brain, cleansed of his mother's voice, freed from the tyranny of rituals, finally began to work. The truth, clear and brutal, hit him like an avalanche. The mystery of Helen's disorder? There was none. There was only life, with its own concerns and priorities. The mystery of the clean pantry? She was simply a frugal, practical woman. The mystery of the shadow in the window? His entire complex, multi-year, exhausting war had been an illusion, a battle with ghosts in his own head. He had been fighting windmills while a real dragon walked through the door. And it wasn't sterility, or order, or ritual that had defeated it. It was a tired, elderly woman with a skillet. Helen, after confirming the threat was neutralized, walked over to the old rotary phone on a small table. Her hand did not tremble. With an icy, almost bored calm, she dialed 911. "An intruder. Come quick. 112 Maple Street." Within minutes, the house was filled with flashing blue lights, loud voices, and uniformed people. Police and paramedics entered and froze, taking in the surreal, inexplicable scene. A man in a pool of blood on the floor. A room. They saw the elderly woman calmly answering questions, and the mailman in his uniform sitting in a corner with bloody fingers and completely empty, unfocused eyes, quietly rocking back and forth. It was a tableau that no police report could ever fully capture, a bizarre collision of worlds that left the first responders speechless. One of the police officers, a young man with a sympathetic face, crouched down in front of Arthur. "Sir, are you okay? Can you tell us what you were doing here?" Arthur was silent. He couldn't speak. The words were gone, just like the voice in his head. He just kept rocking. At that moment, Helen Peterson walked over. She placed her heavy, calloused hand on the officer's shoulder. "Leave him be," she said, her voice thick with a European accent. She looked at Arthur, and her gaze held no anger, no fear, no judgment. Only a heavy, all-knowing, maternal weariness. "The boy, he was just trying to help. With the cleaning." This simple, absurd, illogical phrase, this act of inexplicable, unearned mercy, was the final, most crushing blow for Arthur. The paramedics took the body away. The police, having taken statements and found no logical explanation for the events, prepared to leave. The young officer, looking around the room, shook his head, trying to make sense of the evening. His gaze settled on the dark, sticky, spreading pool of blood, an ugly, chaotic stain on the flawlessly clean floor Arthur had polished. Trying to break the tension, to show some empathy, he said to Helen, "Well, ma'am, I can only imagine the cleanup you have ahead of you." Helen Peterson shifted her weary gaze from her savior tormentor in the corner to this new, real, indelible stain on her floor. She sighed heavily, and her voice held all the wisdom and irony of a long, difficult life. "Looks like I have to clean again."